Good afternoon, good evening for those of us in Europe, and for those in Central Blytheville time, good morning still. Welcome to this second installment of the Blytheville Cold War Forum, sponsored by the National Cold War Center. My name is Christian Ostermann. I direct the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program, and I chair the National Advisory Board of the National Cold War Center. I'm delighted to moderate this forum with Professor Gillian Hartley, my co-chair on the advisory board, who will help join us later during this session. The National Cold War Center is located on the campus of the former Blytheville Air Force Base, originally known as the Blytheville Army Airfield, which opened in 1942 as a training facility for World War II pilots, and at the height of the Cold War was converted into a strategic air command alert mission, which remained a key US military command for 3 decades. The center's mission is to educate and engage visitors in the complex history of and global impact of the Cold War, and to deepen understanding of this important phase in American and international history through immersive experiences on the grounds of this original US Air Force facility. The National Cold War Center has been recognized and officially designated by the state of Arkansas, and last December, the US Congress designated the National Cold War Center as the National Cold War Museum. We anticipate a grand opening of the museum in 2027. The Blytheville Cold War Forum, which will meet every second Wednesday of the month, provides a nonpartisan public platform for the discussion of Cold War history, memory, and heritage. In particular, this forum seeks to foster informed debate over the public history of the Cold War. As part of our webinar series, we'll be also looking occasionally at iconic moments of the Cold War, such as President Ronald Reagan's June 12, 1987 speech in Berlin, and explore the deeper history of these events and how these moments are being captured or can be captured in exhibits and museums for audiences today. We have a terrific panel of experts to launch us into our discussion today, starting with Beth Fischer, leading expert on the Reagan presidency and a professor at the University of Toronto. We're also being joined by Professor Andreas Etges of the University of Munich. Andreas is a leading expert on the public history of the Cold War and chairs the Berlin Cold War Center. Joining us from Moscow is Pavel Palazhchenko, head of public affairs for the Gorbachev Foundation, who served as a translator and advisor to the last Soviet leader. Finally, we're being joined by Melissa Giller of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum in Simi Valley, California, where she oversees exhibits and public affairs. A technical note, this session will be recorded and published on the National Cold War Center's website. To join the conversation, use the raise hand function on Zoom. Once you do that, you'll be put into a queue, and I will call on you at the appropriate time to unmute yourself so you can pose your question or comment. You can also post your question in the Q&A function of Zoom, and then we will put your question to the panelists. You can post those questions now, and hopefully we'll have time to get to them in this panel, which will conclude by 1:30 p.m. Last but not least, I'd like to thank our colleagues at the National Cold War Center for their support of this event, especially Liz Smith of the Board of Directors of the Center and Peter Bierstecker of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program. So then let's get to it. There's little doubt that President Reagan's June 12, 1987 speech at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, especially his famous 4 words, "Tear down this wall," became one of the iconic moments of the Cold War. Stephen Hayward opens his masterful The Age of Reagan, the Conservative Revolution, 1980 to 89, with this quote from Reagan's speech. And William Inboden, in his highly acclaimed book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink, published in 2022, calls the president's phrase the most famous words of the Cold War. But what was the story behind this iconic speech? And what was its larger historical context and significance? What does it tell us about President Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union and its new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev? Who were the audiences that President Reagan tried to address with this speech? What was its impact on the Soviet leaders? What was the reaction in divided Berlin and divided Germany? How much, if at all, did it contribute to the fall of the wall some 2.5 years later? And how is this speech being thought of today and being represented in public memory? How can we appropriately and effectively exhibit historical moments such as this one and convey whatever importance it may have had to the larger public? Let me first turn to Professor Beth Fischer, who, as I'd mentioned, is a leading expert on Reagan's foreign policy. She has published 2 books, The Myth of Triumphalism, Rethinking President Ronald Reagan's Cold War Legacy, published in 2019, and The Reagan Reversal, Foreign Policy at the End of the Cold War, published in 1997. Beth, I wonder if you could put the June 1987 speech into a larger context of the Reagan presidency and President Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union. How did Reagan's views of the Soviet Union develop over the course of his presidency?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me today, Christian. It's exciting to be part of this up-and-coming museum. President Reagan's views about the relationship with the Soviet Union changed over time, as one would expect during an 8-year presidency. When he came to office, his administration mistakenly believed that the United States had fallen behind the Soviet Union in the arms race, or it was about to fall behind. So the first priority for the Reagan administration was to revive and demonstrate American strength. And they did this through 2 ways. One was a military buildup. And so President Reagan instituted the largest peacetime military buildup in US history. And the second thing was by demonstrating resolve, using language such as calling the Soviet Union the evil empire and declaring that democracy would leave communism on the ash heap of history. And all of this was meant to demonstrate US strength. And this is the part of the Reagan presidency that most people remember and often refer to. But this was only the initial couple of years of what turned out to be an 8-year presidency. What people tend to overlook is that President Reagan's policy was called peace through strength. And the aim of the buildup was to match Soviet strength in the belief that if the United States caught up to the Soviet Union would be more inclined to return to the negotiating table and agree to arms reductions. So it seems a bit counterintuitive, but the aim of the buildup was to eventually bring about a reduction in nuclear arsenals. And this was peace through strength. And the final 6 years of the Reagan presidency was focused on this goal, reducing, or as President Reagan preferred, eliminating nuclear arms, and in that context, improving relations with the Soviet Union. And this part of the policy was largely successful. President Reagan met with his Soviet counterpart more frequently than any previous US president. And he and Mikhail Gorbachev negotiated the one and only treaty to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons, the 1987 Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, or the INF Treaty. Oops, Christian, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Thanks very much, Beth. Could you talk just for a moment about kind of the immediate context of the speech? Why was Reagan in Europe, and what were what was the immediate aftermath of the speech leading up to the next summit with Gorbachev?
Sure, sure. So things were not great at home in June of 1987. In that spring and summer, you had the congressional investigations into Iran-Contra going on. It probably was one of the low points of the Reagan presidency. So the administration decided to do what most presidents do when they're having trouble at home. They decided that Reagan would take a trip abroad, and that could demonstrate his role as a global leader and as a statesman. So he took this trip to Europe. Internationally, what was going on is that by June of 1987, Gorbachev's reforms were a little over 2 years old. So it seemed like things were changing in the Soviet Union. It wasn't clear whether they would be permanent or what, but there were definite signs of change in the Soviet Union. There had been 2 summit meetings already, Geneva in November of 1985 and the Reykjavik summit in October of 1986. And that was the summit in which Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan came this close to agreeing to eliminate nuclear arsenals together, which is something that President Reagan genuinely wanted. The INF Treaty, as I mentioned earlier, was in the final stages of being negotiated and would eventually be signed in December of 1987 at the Washington summit. So things were going pretty well in terms of superpower relations, not so great at home. Reagan was also encountering some criticism from his fellow conservatives. A lot of his fellow conservatives did not trust Gorbachev. They didn't really believe his reforms. They thought it might be a trick. They were skeptical of the summit meetings. They were appalled by President Reagan's calls to eliminate nuclear arsenals. They were appalled by the outcome of the Reykjavik summit. Even though there was no agreement at the end of Reykjavik, they were appalled that President Reagan would have agreed to eliminate nuclear weapons. And so you had these conservatives start to step up their criticism of Ronald Reagan. So you had conservative pundits like George Will and Charles Krauthammer publishing public criticisms of Reagan. President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who had been estranged for 10 years, didn't even talk to one another. After Reykjavik, they were so appalled by what they saw, they joined together and wrote an op-ed that criticized President Reagan and in particular his policy toward the Soviet Union. So in Newt Gingrich, the Committee on the Present Danger, all these conservatives were criticizing Reagan for his approach to the Soviet Union, kind of indicating, look, you've been beguiled by this guy, you need to step back a bit. So there was an element of, Reagan needed to appease, or may have felt that he needed to appease his conservative critics. And so by using rather direct language at the Brandenburg Gate, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, he was in essence throwing a bone to fellow conservatives who really enjoyed and supported the anti-communist side of President Reagan, but didn't really support the desire to abolish nuclear weapons.
Great. So would you argue this domestic audience was a primary one, or what were the other audience's intentions behind this speech?
Yeah, so I think the primary audience was more conservative critics at home. But there was more than just that. There's essentially three schools of thought about this speech. One is the triumphalist view, which is President Reagan said, tear down this wall, and 2.5 years later, the wall fell, and it fell because of Ronald Reagan. The second view is this was just political theater. It was a throwaway line. It didn't mean anything. A third view is that he was speaking to his conservative critics and trying to demonstrate that he was still an anti-communist. And you have to keep in mind that the INF Treaty was coming closer and closer to resolution, and President Reagan needed the support of conservative members the Senate in order to approve of the INF Treaty, and that was very important to him. But I also think I spoke with Peter Robinson, who wrote the speech, and he explained that he had gone on an advanced trip to West Berlin when he was writing the speech. And even though the State Department and the National Security Council had, don't call out Gorbachev, look, things are going really well, let's just keep them going well. Peter Robinson spoke with a lot of West Berliners, and he personally was struck by the stories of divided families and divided friendships and the personal impact that the wall had taken. And Robinson felt that these human stories would also resonate with Ronald Reagan, which they did. Reagan often expressed his policy views in terms of human relationships and human beings. So when Peter Robinson wrote those words into the speech, I think they resonated with Reagan.
And he used, I think, these words later on repeatedly. I mean, they really stuck with him and meant a lot to him.
Absolutely. Look, this was not new policy. The United States had always said we want the wall to come down. President Reagan had been saying it since at least 1982. He said in 1986. He repeated it again in 1987. I think what's unique about this event was the direct language. The language was really striking, as well as the scene, standing in front of Brandenburg Gate.
Great. Well, let me turn to Pavel Palazhchenko. Pavel, you served as a translator in the Soviet government since 1974, at the Foreign Ministry since 1980, and then you participated as an advisor and translator, interpreter to Mikhail Gorbachev and Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze in all of the US-Soviet summit and ministerial meetings between 1985 and 1991. It's incredible and wonderful to have you here as an eyewitness to these events. So you had a front row seat in this developing relationship between Gorbachev and Reagan. And in his speech, Reagan addressed these four words, tear down this wall, directly at Mr. Gorbachev. It's Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. By the way, he did not use General Secretary Gorbachev or any other title. So how did the Soviet leadership, how did Gorbachev react to this speech?
Yeah, that's a good question, an interesting question. Actually, Peter Robinson at an event a few years ago, probably like 15 or even 20 years ago, did put this question to Gorbachev himself. And he actually said before he asked Gorbachev that he was the person who wrote the speech. And Gorbachev basically said, well, we always knew that President Reagan's first profession was an actor, and therefore he suggested that this was just the theatrics. One might criticize Gorbachev for that, but it was a sincere answer. And I did not hear that speech in 1987 during the final dash toward the INF Treaty. I did not hear that speech mentioned by either Gorbachev or any of his advisors. So one might say that Gorbachev was so focused on the main thing, and that is to finally conclude the first arms reduction rather than just arms control treaty, that he did not pay much attention to that speech. And I would argue that that was probably the best reaction, because had he taken it personally, then perhaps he would have been annoyed, he would have been irritated by this speech and by this particular phrase. So I would say that one thing about that phrase that probably was wrong was actually those two words, Mr. Gorbachev. Gorbachev always felt that it was not up to the Soviet Union to decide for the governments and for the people of countries that were at that time our allies. It was not for Gorbachev to give an instruction, a directive to Erich Honecker and the leadership of East Germany, because that would definitely not work, and that could actually be counterproductive, and certainly that was part of his overall approach. Not doing it was part of his overall approach to the countries that at that time were part of the Warsaw Pact. The first thing that he said to the group of Eastern European leaders who came to Moscow for the funeral of Gorbachev's predecessor, Konstantin Chernenko, was that it is up to you to decide how you conduct your domestic and foreign policy, and we will not interfere. We will fulfill all our obligations, in particular as regards the supply of natural resources and the various economic benefits that those countries were receiving, like low prices for oil and gas and things like that, but we will not interfere. And actually, Gorbachev himself said later that that was the end of the Brezhnev doctrine. Basically, the Brezhnev doctrine, which was never announced or given the name of Leonid Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, was that the Soviet Union does bear ultimate responsibility for the fate of socialism, for being the guardian of socialism in those countries, and so it could, in certain circumstances, interfere the way it did in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So what Gorbachev said was, or meant, that this would not happen again. And I think that he fulfilled that promise. And I think that was one of the great things, actually, that Gorbachev did. Maybe we'll talk today a little bit about what happened later when the wall was torn down, not at Gorbachev's orders, but because of the confluence of circumstances and because of the will of the people of Germany, particularly East Germany. So I would say that, I would repeat that probably this reaction of Gorbachev, a reaction of certain indifference, was probably the best reaction. It could have been much worse. It could have been a reaction of annoyance, of irritation, and that could have affected the discussions that then were ongoing, the negotiations in Geneva, but also negotiations at a higher level between Shevardnadze and Scholz, and the exchanges of letters between Gorbachev and Reagan. I think both leaders were focused. The Reagan speech was perhaps indeed important for the president's relations with his fellow conservatives, perhaps in other domestic politics respects. But generally, I think it was more the human side of it. You know, Reagan was, of course, a great politician, but he was also a human being. And I think so far as nuclear weapons are concerned, it was his very human position. He believed that nuclear weapons were weapons of devastation, of genocide. And just like Gorbachev, he just believed that humankind will have to abandon nuclear weapons. And similarly, I heard also from Peter Robinson that, yes, he was touched by the stories of divided families, by the stories of people who tried to cross the wall and in some way get to the West. and some of them lost their lives as a result. So I think it was also the human side of it. It's not just Reagan trying to show his strength, that he was tough, that he was anti-communist. I would not neglect that human aspect. So, as I said, at that time, we were not yet quite sure that the INF Treaty would be signed before the end of the year. As you may recall, at that time, there was a particularly, I would say, tough issue with the Pershing 1A missiles that formerly belonged to Western Germany. I personally felt only in August of that year that the treaty would be signed when Chancellor Kohl said that even though these treaties, these weapons, these missiles should not be a part of the INF Treaty, he said, we have decided unilaterally to scrap, to give up those missiles. So it was only in August, maybe in September, that I felt, and many of us felt, that the treaty would be signed. And for Gorbachev, the first step toward nuclear disarmament was a lot more important than any irritants, such as the speech of President Reagan in Berlin. And you have to remember, at that time, in many respects, our relations with the United States were, so to say, touch and go. I would say that, for example, there were continuing things like spy scandals, electronic eavesdropping accusations by both sides, and things were, even after it became clear that we were on track to the INF Treaty. There was the spy scandal involving Nicholas Danilov, an American reporter in Moscow who was arrested after a Soviet UN official was arrested for spying. And so everything was touch and go. And I think ultimately it is to the credit of both leaders, Gorbachev and Reagan, that they, being very different, of course, and having different ideological and political and other views, they kept their eyes on the ball. And I think one can say that it was after the conclusion of the INF Treaty in December 1987 that relations were on track. This is not to diminish the importance of President Reagan's speech. I look at it, once again, I would repeat, as a speech more of a human being than of a politician.
Thank you. Just one question. President Reagan wasn't the only one who was dealing with conservative critics. Did the speech cause any debate or controversy within the Soviet leadership? Do you recall that, or?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. At that time, the criticism of Gorbachev from what I would call the Bolshevik section of the Soviet leadership, who later took positions that contradicted Gorbachev's position, particularly, Gorbachev's willingness and openness to different ideologies, to an ideology that would break with Marxism, Leninism. That was something that Yegor Ligachev and others considered wrong. But at that time, it was not yet quite clear that Gorbachev is so open to a different kind of ideological narrative. And all Soviet leaders, all members of the Politburo, agreed with Gorbachev on the importance of first steps toward nuclear disarmament. And this was regarded basically as the speech of President Reagan, and almost all other international issues were regarded more as a sideshow rather than the really important movement that at that time would again, I would repeat, with a lot of difficulties, a lot of bumps on the road, but the movement was in that direction, and everyone, including those who turned out to be reactionary and conservatives later, everyone was focused on that.
Fascinating. Thank you. Let me bring Andreas into this. Andreas Etges, as mentioned, Andreas has extensive experience in researching and writing about the Cold War, including the public history of the Cold War, and he's co-editor of the journal International Public History. Reagan's speech in Berlin was addressed also to audiences in Berlin, in Germany, in fact, in Eastern Europe. He mentions that in the speech. So, Andreas, what was the reaction of Berliners and Germans in East and West to the speech, and how, was the speech received in the media and in the public in Germany?
Yes, and also thank you for letting me part of this. I think what's important to see is that things were really in flux, and for the context of it, people in East Germany were getting more and more frustrated with the rigid leadership. And actually, the rigid East German leadership had their problems with Gorbachev as a reformer. And it was the 750th anniversary of the city. So both sides of the city staged major cultural events. And near the Reichstag, there was just a few days before Reagan came, there were huge rock and pop concerts, including David Bowie. East Germans flocked to the border to listen to it. The speakers had been turned around. David Bowie was welcoming them. And then the police intervened and clubbed them and pushed them away. And what did people shout? The wall must go, away with the wall, and Gorbachev, and they praised Gorbachev. So they basically made the same demand in some ways that Reagan did a few days later from East Germans on the other side of the wall. The other thing is, and Beth, you explained how Reagan changed. I don't think the German public saw this. Reagan was extremely unpopular. And before George W. Bush and now Donald Trump, I think he's the most unpopular, still unpopular US president in the post-war period. I looked at public opinion polls at the time, and actually Gorbachev was far more popular in Germany at the time when Reagan came than Reagan was. That one poll agency looked at, and people could give grades -5 to +5. Reagan was -0.1. Gorbachev was +0.2, very close to the most popular German politician at the time, or foreign minister. So extremely popular. I think that is also important to see. So when Reagan came, and of course the thing was staged at the Brandenburg Gate, and Reagan clearly also referred to directly and indirectly to the very popular and successful visit of John F. Kennedy decades later. Well, Reagan could not be out in the crowd. So the 20,000+ people in front of Reagan who cheered him were a very well-selected group of people who everyone knew would cheer Reagan. Many Americans, and I just heard something from the former mayor of Berlin at the time, who said that even Americans were brought in from West Germany to cheer Ronald Reagan. So a highly select group. Well, at the same time, tens of thousands of people in the city of Berlin were demonstrating against Reagan the night before, clashing with police. And then actually the district of Kreuzberg, which is a very left-wing district with hardline left-wing people who often had clashes with police, was actually put under siege for several hours that day. And still there were clashes that day. So Reagan never met the believers while he spoke to a crowd of select people that would welcome the speech. Now, the reaction was, and depending on where people stood politically, of course, the speech made front-page headlines in left-wing and conservative newspapers, and especially Reagan's demand to put down, for Gorbachev to open the gate and tear the wall down. But most people didn't saw this as, well, Reagan is giving one of his speeches, but no one really thought it mattered, right? The wall wouldn't come down in the foreseeable future. No one will see this in their lifetime. Let him say those things. Yes, and some people, as Pavel also said, saw him, well, he's the actor, so he's giving those types of speeches, he's staging something, but it doesn't matter that much. it's interesting to see how the East German media reacted. And I looked at some of the newspapers there, and they very much followed the line given by the Soviet Union, because they also, next to their own articles, they published articles from Soviet newspapers or news agencies, and basically copied or more or less confirmed what the Soviets were saying, that this was quoting Pravda, this is an anti-Soviet propaganda crazy show. Actually, they said it in this way. This is a provocative and militant speech. And they at least focused as much on what was happening with the clashes with police and with the city under siege. Of course, that were big headlines. You're speaking about freedom, and look what's happening in West Berlin. You're putting the city basically under siege and clubbing down people who just want to demonstrate. Well, many of them did want to have fights with the police, which we also know. But this is what they could focus on. And yes, they also made the point, this is a former actor, and this is all highly staged to provoke us. And they felt provoked to a certain degree.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's hard to forget the image of Ronald Reagan at the time versus what we think now of the Reagan-Gorbachev partnership in ending the Cold War, where I think much of the historiography now credits Reagan and Gorbachev in major ways for ending the Cold War arms race and the Cold War as such. But if I can get us back to that moment in June 1987 once more, and if you could just talk about Berlin as a stage for the ideological, the rhetorical struggle between East and West. Reagan very consciously used the backdrop of the Brandenburg Gate, but he was not the first one to do so. If you can just talk a little bit about Berlin as a stage for the Cold War competition.
Mm-hmm. And actually, just to mention that didn't end with the Cold War. When Obama, as a senator, wanted to give a speech in Berlin, he wanted to speak at the Brandenburg Gate, but he wasn't allowed to. So he had to do it at the Victory Column in front of tens of thousands of people. But he also wanted to play that role there. So, I mean, clearly, I think that the stage literally was set by John F. Kennedy in 1963, coming to Berlin. Well, he was cheered by hundreds of thousands of people in the street, stopped at several points in the city to look over the wall, like at Brandenburg Gate. There's photos of him looking there, and the East Germans kind of had covered the Brandenburg Gate so that he couldn't look through. He stopped at Checkpoint Charlie, looked over the wall, and then gave several speeches, but the most famous one, of course, at City Hall in Schöneberg, using some German words too. And I think this also put other later presidents under pressure to also say something in German. But actually, I think Kennedy had been put under pressure by Charles de Gaulle, who didn't visit Berlin in 1962, but he came to West Germany and celebrated the West German people and the German people per se. And it's wonderful in American newsreel how they count. There were more people seeing Kennedy than de Gaulle. So basically, we won, we are more important than that. And Reagan used several German phrases. And I also read things from Peter Robinson, who even thought of putting some more German in and not saying Mr. Gorbachev, but Herr Gorbachev, which they decided he shouldn't do. He should use the English for that. But Reagan said, there's only one Berlin. I still have a suitcase in Berlin, playing on a popular Berlin song, and also praising Berliners in several other ways. And I think also in the way he defined Berlin. Now, Berlin, with the airlift and with the blockade of Berlin, had taken on a major symbolic significance for the United States, and kind of has been described as a frontier city with all the American symbolism of freedom and so on. And Kennedy re-emphasized this in major ways, of course, a couple of years after the building of the Berlin Wall. And I think in Reagan's speech, not only does he mention Kennedy at the very beginning, but also he echoes Kennedy's words and the often misunderstood "Ich bin ein Berliner," with which Kennedy didn't really say I'm a citizen of Berlin, but every citizen of the free world is a Berliner, because Berlin is the symbol of the free world. And in that sense, also kind of an American city and an American symbol. And Reagan nearly literally echoes that. The Kennedy speech at City Hall. Schöneberg, he picks a different side. And this is the American decision. They want they want Reagan to speak at the Brandenburg Gate with the back towards the east, but also literally mentioning the east and mentioning the people who can hear him on the other side through radio or television, which they could. But clearly the whole team, the speechwriters and others, are very much aware how an American president can be presented in a city that is maybe not the dangerous city that it was in the earlier Cold War, but is still a highly symbolic, highly loaded city for both sides. And maybe one more remark, the East German newspapers, one comment they made is, well, you know, the American president cannot walk freely in the city anymore. Gorbachev can, and he's celebrated by the people. So indirectly making the Kennedy comparison there. Though, of course, the East German leadership had their own problems with Gorbachev, but he was celebrated by people when he was in East Berlin a few weeks before Reagan came to West Berlin.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andreas. Let me turn to Melissa Giller, Chief Marketing Officer of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. She oversees all of the public programming, including a lot of the exhibits. And I'd like to turn to Melissa to just talk a little bit about how the Reagan Library and the Museum and the Institute exhibit Reagan's foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And you know, how do you turn a historic moment of, you know, significance into an exhibit? Melissa, Zoom room is yours.
Well, thank you for having me. So as you said, you know, I work at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum, which is really the life and times of President Reagan, from birth through his presidency, post-presidency, and then, of course, the weeks surrounding his passing. And at the Reagan Museum, we couldn't really tell that story without also telling the story of Ronald Reagan's relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev. In fact, my Zoom background is the gallery we have that really focuses on that relationship. In the United States, U.S. presidents tend to be judged on their first 100 days in office. And for President Reagan, he was judged on his first 70 days. And that's because on the 70th day in office, he was shot. And while he was recovering after surgery, he wrote in his diary that he truly believed, he had a very strong faith in God, and he truly believed that his life had been spared so that he could really work on his mission and his principles and initiatives to help bring an end to the Cold War, to help bring an end to communism. He immediately reached out to Brezhnev, didn't get anywhere, you know, Andreas Palazhchenko, and then found truly not just an ally, but a friend in Gorbachev. In fact, we even tell the story of post-presidency. President and Mrs. Reagan hosted the Gorbachevs at Reagan's ranch in the Santa Ynez Mountains near Santa Barbara. That wasn't policy, that was friendship. So we do tell that story. The gallery that you're seeing behind me really focuses on those 4 summits I believe Beth spoke about earlier that led to the signing of the INF Treaty. And on the wall opposite side of the statues, we talk about the Brandenburg Wall speech. We have Ronald Reagan's actual speech cards from that speech. We have the suit he wore. And the interesting story about that suit is, you know, I mentioned a little bit ago that on the 70th day of his presidency, he was shot. And when he was shot, it was the first time he'd worn a specific suit that had been hand-tailored for him. And when he recovered, he was dismayed to find out that the doctors, of course, to save his life, had completely cut the suit off of him and destroyed it. So he asked for a second suit, identical suit, to be made. It's a suit he really liked, and he specifically chose that suit to wear for the Brandenburg Gate speech. And you know, hearing all of you, and I know where you're coming from, that he was sort of taken as an actor, but that speech did mean a lot to him. He put a lot of thought into it. In fact, even down to, maybe this does go back to him being an actor, but even to the cufflinks and tie tack you were wearing, they were gifts from Mrs. Reagan. He considered them his lucky tie tack and cufflinks. She had given them to him on one of their wedding anniversaries. So he really had sort of thought through all the details. And again, we show that here on display in the Reagan Museum. We also have an entire gallery dedicated to the story of the Brandenburg Gate, the Berlin Wall. We have a real piece of the Berlin Wall here on our property. And in fact, years after Ronald Reagan left office, we do something called the Ronald Reagan Freedom Award. We've only given it out to about 12 people in the past 30 years. Gorbachev is one of the people who did receive that award. It's an award we give to people who we really believe changed the course of the world's freedom, nation's freedom, their own freedom. And Ronald Reagan himself bestowed the award upon Gorbachev, and we have pictures of them at our piece of the Berlin Wall. Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about audience reactions to the exhibit? Do you measure that? Does it allow, especially next generations to connect with these historic moments and actors?
Yeah, so we have two different reactions within this exhibition. Probably those who are of the age when Ronald Reagan was in office, and those who are obviously younger. The reaction we get to the people who are of age and remembering the Reagan presidency, we have the actual INF Treaty that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed on display in this gallery, along with the pens they used to sign the treaty, as well as the 1985 Cultural Exchange Treaty that the two nations signed to help college students go back and forth and share in each other's culture. Those original documents are on display in that gallery. And when we walk people in there that, again, are of age to remember the presidency, to remember the INF Treaty, to remember those different policies, even though the INF Treaty isn't really in force anymore the way it was when Reagan and Gorbachev signed it, people stop in their tracks. They go over there, they stare at it, they murmur wow, and really spend time at it to think about the historical impact it had on our two different countries. The younger generation, who may not necessarily know of that story, we sometimes have on display. It's not permanent, but it's actually on display right now. As Beth said earlier, right? The signing of the INF Treaty led to the elimination of many warheads. In fact, by 1991, I think it's like 2,700 or so were destroyed. And when they were destroyed in both the Soviet Union and the United States, 15 were deactivated and kept for educational purposes. And one of those 15 was donated to the Reagan Library. And every so often, including right now, we have that on display. And we talk about the story of the Cold War, the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, and what that missile actually meant. And that's when the younger generation sort of sits back and thinks, and we hear a lot of comments of, oh my God, I can't believe that's a nuclear warhead, especially in light of what's going on now in the world, to be re-educated about what was going on in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to see an actual nuclear warhead that was deactivated back from the Cold War. That's what really gets at the younger generation.
Thank you. Right, we're getting towards the end of our discussion. Let me perhaps ask the entire group then if you can just give your perspective on the importance of the Berlin speech, and especially those 4 words. It coincides actually with a question by one of our viewers, Sean King, who writes that he wholly concurs with Andreas. Sean made his first 2 visits to Berlin in April and June 1987, when I was a high school exchange student in Sweden, and people were much more positive on the David Bowie concert than Reagan's speech. When I visited the Tränenpalast Museum in 2019, a new museum in Berlin, I noticed the storyboards go out of their way to thank George Herbert Walker Bush for negotiating unification while hardly mentioning Reagan at all. So if you can just comment on, in the end, the importance, the historic importance of the speech and this moment. As I said, it is widely considered an iconic moment, perhaps the most important 4 words uttered in the Cold War. Is that so, Beth?
I think it has gained in importance over the years. If you go back to the American press at the time, it was not front frontline news. There, as I said, Iran-Contra was going on. There were other things going on. If you look, for example, at the biography of Secretary of State George Shultz, which is very detailed, 1,200 pages, he doesn't even mention the speech in his memoirs, and neither does Jack Matlock, who was Reagan's Soviet advisor, went on to become ambassador to the Soviet Union. And at the time when the wall fell, the majority of Americans did not attribute that event to Reagan. There was a poll taken 4 days after the wall fell, and 43% of Americans said it fell owing to Gorbachev, and 14% named Reagan. And interestingly, going to Andreas's point about how the Germans have never been that enthralled with Reagan or his legacy, in Germany, just after the wall fell, in a poll, 70% of West Germans credited Gorbachev and 2% credited Reagan. And as Andreas said, the German opinion hasn't changed very much on that. So I think it has grown in importance over time, owing to the direct language, the symbolism of the speech. I think Gorbachev and the East and West Germans played a larger role. And maybe Andreas wants to talk of this, is really the wall opened owing to an administrative error. This is the bureaucratic mistake that had the biggest influence in modern times, I think. But there you go.
Yeah, because of the announcement that was made by a member of the East German Politburo, where he phrased it in a way that people understood that the wall is opening, that the wall is coming down, and they all flocked there, and they basically physically torn down parts of the wall. So yes, I do remember that very well, and I think that in different ways, Gorbachev and Reagan, and of course also President Bush, by the way he negotiated important aspects of the process of German unification, all of them contributed. But Gorbachev was asked, actually, I think in '88, during his visit to West Germany, when he had negotiations with Chancellor Kohl, and he was asked either at a press conference or just by a reporter, when a reporter approached him at some point of that visit, whether he believed that Germany will be reunited one day. And Gorbachev said that this is not something that could happen today or tomorrow, but he believed that as the world evolves and as East and West come closer together, as the Cold War gradually becomes a thing of the past, conditions will be different, and then the people will decide. And when years later, during one of the anniversaries of the wall coming down, Gorbachev spoke, I think, in Frankfurt in a major speech when he recounted the whole chain of events of unification. He said something that I always like to quote, and that is that there were two heroes of the process of German unification: the Russian people, for being magnanimous and for being willing to forget about, not to forget, but to leave behind the war in which the people of Russia suffered so much, and the German people for proving their commitment to democracy, for building a democratic state, and for pledging that from Chancellor Kohl, that's the phrase of Chancellor Kohl, that from Germany, war will never come again, but only peace. So commitment to peace and democracy, that makes the German people the hero of unification, and the Russian people for their magnanimity and for leaving the past in the past. And I think that that is very important. And specifically during the Reagan time, the role of Gorbachev and Reagan was that they brought the world closer to the moment when unification became possible.
Thank you. Andreas, do you agree with that?
Yes, I basically agree with what the two have said. There have been repeated attempts in the last 10, 20 years to have a major street or place named after Ronald Reagan in Berlin. That has failed so far. There's a little plaque near, not at the Brandenburg Gate, near the Brandenburg Gate with image and a few words from the speech. There is now a statue in the American embassy on a terrace there. The American embassy is right very close to the Brandenburg Gate, but there's nothing yet in the city of Berlin. Regarding the importance of the speech, I mean, I myself was on the side, not in Berlin itself, but in other cases on the side of the protesters against Ronald Reagan. Now, being a scholar of the Cold War, I would give him much more credit for, and in the way Beth has also described it, for helping to end the Cold War, though not kind of in the triumphalist sense that is often there. And I think in the speech only really gained significance in retrospect, that some people kind of claimed this was kind of prophetic. I want to give one quote from President George W. Bush when at the dedication ceremony of the Victims of Communism Memorial in Washington, D.C., where he said, President Reagan went to Berlin. He was clear in his statement. He said, tear down the wall, and 2 years later, the wall fell. Well, that story, of course, is way too simple. Mikhail Gorbachev played a big role. The East Germans and others played a big role. And yes, no one made the decision to open the wall or to open the gates. It was an accident, a wonderful accident of history. It happened peacefully. But I would say Reagan played a big role in ending the Cold War, but not in the sense that the wall was opened. That didn't have anything, at least it didn't have anything to do with the speech, I would argue.
Thank you. If not the Berlin speech, point to a moment, point to perhaps a speech or another moment that you think would be deserves the significance that history has ascribed to Berlin's speech. Any takers for this one?
You mean in ending the Cold War?
Looking at the end of the Cold War.
In ending the Cold War, because Schultz said, for example, that it was Gorbachev's speech at the UN in December 1988 that basically meant the end of the Cold War. Others believed that it was President Reagan's reply to a question by an American reporter in Moscow during his final visit to Moscow in summer 1988, when the reporter asked whether Reagan still believed that the Soviet Union was an evil empire. And without missing a beat, Reagan said no, because this country is changing under the leadership of President Gorbachev, and I'm sure that we will cooperate and we will become partners. So there were quite a few moments. The end of the Cold War was a process, and it set the stage for the people, as Gorbachev said, of Russia, the Soviet Union, and Germany to leave that terrible thing, the wall, which I would say no one particularly liked, to leave that in the past.
Beth, any favorites for an alternative iconography of the end of the Cold War?
I would say the Reykjavik summit in October of 1986, when they both, Reagan and Gorbachev, expressed their sincere desire to reduce, if not eliminate, nuclear weapons. And even though the meeting was tense and they didn't come to an agreement at that summit, I think once they got home and tempers cooled, they realized that they both had the same objective and that they could work together to achieve that.
Thank you. Melissa, are there any other moments that the exhibit captures?
Specifically on ending the Cold War, no, it really focuses on the four summits and how the four summits helped bring an end to the Cold War. If I could add one more thing that our galleries do have is we do talk about the fact that Mikhail Gorbachev did attend Ronald Reagan's funeral and how much it meant to Mrs. Reagan to have him there to show his friendship and support of the president and his beliefs. So that's the story that we tell here.
Thank you.
So I think you're sitting in front of a sculpture, and if I'm not mistaken, that's the Geneva scene, right? The famous photograph, and I think, to me, this is a key moment that started off a relationship. I mean, Reagan, how he had talked about the Soviet Union, now he finally meets that young person, and they hit it off. They start a personal relationship with all the problems in Reykjavik and elsewhere. But to me, yes, the photo is, of course, a little staged. They want to be seen there, but that moment meeting there, I think, turn things around in major ways.
Yeah,
Well,
but the photo also behind Melissa, I think, as I look at it, it's on your left, and that is Gorbachev and Reagan leaving the Hovde House in Reykjavik, actually both quite disappointed that they were not able to sign even some kind of a declaration of intent on putting an end to nuclear weapons. That's an amazing photo, and it's an example of how things retrospectively can look quite different from the way they look immediately. Reagan initially believed that Reykjavik was a failure. Schultz said so, but then ultimately it turned out that this was really one of the turning points in the process that led to the end of the Cold War. And I think it's the end of the Cold War that set the stage for the wall going down. So it's certainly more complicated than some of the narrative that people have about a particular point, a particular speech, a particular event. It's a lot more complicated, but I think we're all lucky that it led to the peaceful end of the Cold War.
Thank you. I think, Pavel, these are wonderful words to end our rich discussion on today. Thank you so much, Beth, Andreas, Pavel, Melissa, and the National Cold War Center team for this good conversation. We will be posting the video of this event soon. Thank you all, and see you in about a month for the next Blytheville Cold War Forum. Thank you.